Database DevOps with Kendra Little.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, welcome back. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. You can go to, as always, www.azuredevops.show to see past episodes and show notes. And one of the things that we've been announcing on the show ever since May was my new book coming out, .NET DevOps for Azure. And one of the offers, by the way, you can find it at bit.ly/.NET DevOps book. That's bit.ly/.NET DevOps book spelled out. And you can also get the ebook at bit.ly/.NET DevOps ebook. And if you are running a user group, or if you're speaking at a user group or regional conference, then we'd love to support you with a few print copies to give away at the event. And so just get in touch. We'd be happy to support you with that. My guest today is Kendra Little, and she's a DevOps advocate for Redgate Software and a Microsoft certified master in SQL Server. She's been awarded the Most Valuable Professional Award by Microsoft 7 times, and she's trained IT leaders, developers, and database administrators around the world on topics including performance tuning, preventing and managing incidents with business-critical databases, and optimizing operations and the software development cycle. Kendra, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I am doing great. It's great to be here.
I'm excited about today's topic because it doesn't get much play in the sea of noise about DevOps for, let's say, web applications or backend services, but it's kind of a hard topic and you live in it day in and day out.
It's a hard topic, but it's where I think a lot of the magic happens. I mean, we're at a point where a lot of agile software development methods have been, picked up by a lot of people. A lot of people have worked these through for their application development. And so people can now, if they've embraced DevOps especially, really deliver value at a good regular tempo for app servers. But that leaves the database as often this huge gating factor. Whenever we need to make a significant change to the database for a lot of organizations, that just means that the whole pipeline kind of gets clogged up because we can put a lot of stuff behind feature flags, but a lot of times we can't turn that feature flag on until the database, either schema changes have happened or a significant data update has happened in the database. So we need to bring that in to the same practices that we're using for Agile and for DevOps in order to be able to have a consistent tempo and to maintain stability in the production servers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you've spoken at SQL in the City and other conferences quite a bit, but for those who are maybe getting to know you for the first time, what's your background and how have you come into this game and what has been your journey so people can get to know you a little bit?
Oh, I love that question. So I've had a really fun career in software development. I got really lucky. Maybe this is close to 20 years ago at this point. Mm-hmm. But when I wanted to work with databases, I actually have a master's degree in philosophy. So that kind of tells you how practical a person I am. But when I was working on my philosophy degree, what I found was I really didn't enjoy the work I was doing with philosophy, but what I really loved doing was my work study job, which was working with databases. So I discovered this love for relational databases and, trying to get a job with a degree in philosophy is kind of interesting, but I got a job at a little startup. And I started out in support, but I ended up landing in a position called build operations. Mm. And essentially, this was before we had even the term, agile. It was, or before we had ever heard of it at our startup. We did eventually start extreme programming and that kind of thing, but it was early days for that. But my job was essentially to automate the creation and maintenance of all our development and pre-production environments, and to also try to optimize we had many different software teams, maybe 8 or 9, and to work with each of them to kind of figure out, okay, what is our build and deployment process like, and how can we begin to change this over time? Because we did, as a company, change a lot while I worked there. So it was this amazing experience of this transformation to test-driven development, to agile methodology, and I still love the term extreme programming. I find it very funny, just extreme,
Right.
But that was really where I learned about what databases are and how they work. And one of the really cool things, like looking back, I was so lucky to get this job because we also had this in-house built non-relational database because we were in online advertising. So there was just this massive amount of cookie data that you would not put in a relational database. So we essentially had this homegrown, very Hadoop-like NoSQL database. Of course, I hadn't heard the term NoSQL, but we had a whole team that worked on that too. And I got to learn bits about how that worked, how we could move data between that and the relational databases, what use cases were better for different types of databases. Just the most, I think, it was a very rich environment for me to learn about database development as well as software development. So that was really the foundation of my career. And I still really look back to that, kind of first real tech job as the inspiration for everything that's come later. Because after that, I eventually worked at Microsoft for 5 years. Learned a lot about operations and how Microsoft does development. I started a consulting company with some friends and got to figure out, okay, how do I start a small business? How do I run it? How do we develop a custom performance tuning offering? And how do we try to make that profitable? Which was very interesting as well. And now I've kind of circled back and said, what I found I was really missing I was like, I really want to be involved in the software development lifecycle again. Like there's something about figuring out what is the most efficient way to ship quality code for databases that's just intrinsically interesting to me. And I think a lot of it is due to that first job I had where, that was really our mission, was to transform that and to make it better.
Yeah.
And of course, we made a lot of mistakes as well as having a lot of successes.
Oh, that's how we learn. That's how we learn. So there seems to be, at least it appears from where I sit, a huge divide on answering the question, what the heck is database DevOps, and the world of massive interconnected databases that have been around for a long time and don't move very fast. And then the distributed applications or more standalone databases that don't have all the linked servers and the dependencies between them. And guess what? You actually have a database that you can work with as a part of an application. And people trying to answer the question, okay, what does DevOps mean for both of those worlds? So what say you? What the heck is database DevOps, and how should people be thinking about it? And should the database even be included with an application's DevOps environment?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, to me, an essential part of database DevOps is really addressing the massive silos that we historically have had, especially with relational databases, with the people who have the knowledge in that domain, right? So traditionally, and this I think can happen with non-relational databases too. You get on the ops side, people who just have a ton of domain knowledge and expertise. And database DevOps is really about shifting their part in the process left. The traditional way is you want to make a change to a database. It goes through, the whole software development lifecycle. And at the end, it gets reviewed by these people who have really strong domain knowledge and maybe gets kicked back by them, right? So to me, really the essence of database DevOps is figuring out how to get all of that specialized domain knowledge early in the process so that we can have quality changes from the beginning and that we just save all of that wasted effort. So to me, the shift left part is especially critical because of the just deeply entrenched silos that we have with these roles. Sometimes it's a little less for newer databases that are non-relational, simply because a lot of times when these do come into organizations, sometimes they don't always go into the operations silo, right? Sometimes they become more managed by the development side. I think with those, there is still there's a lot of value in bringing in people with the operational mindset and skills into that processing and just getting a lot of value out of the things that they know. But it isn't always as hard for that, because it's more of, come learn about this new thing you haven't worked with yet, rather than we want you to give up this control mindset you've had over this thing for, 30 years with relational databases, right? With relational databases, we've very long had these silos, and the role of operations has been command and control over those. We need to defend them. We need to protect them. And a huge part of database DevOps is shifting that. So that is a very shared model. And it is more about the DBAs having the ability to kind of set guardrails around, okay, we do want to be innovative, but we want to be kind of innovative in this space, because if we go outside the space, we have risk of data breaches, for example, or, you know what I mean? There's bad things that happen over there, but it's not controlling every single thing that we do, So I think it's a huge shift there. And to me, that's kind of the essence of it. That's the hard part rather than the technology.
Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned shift left, and you also mentioned the control. Now, that would presume, and correct me if I'm wrong about what you're saying, some type of Kanban or left to right process. Everybody seems to be working on these boards with cards these days, and work starts on the left, and you move it column by column to on the right. And if you shift it left, then that means instead of a developer making a database change and then some DBA looking at it later on down the road, where should the DBA be in that process when you're saying, hey, let's plan a change, and then at some point somebody writes the code, and then you check it, and then somebody's using it in production?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think there's really two places. One place is pull requests. So when there is a change to database code, it can really make sense to have not only the optimal, I was reading recently, the optimal number of reviewers. There've been some studies that say, 2 is kind of an optimal number for reviewers for a pull request. By the way, I haven't looked deeply into the science on that. So this is something I read on the internet that might be true. Right. But having, for database changes, having a relationship with these teams where you function, it's probably still a separate DBA team, but you function as one team to the point where you can have one of those reviewers be a person from the database team. You can also, make those really fine-grained. If you don't want if the DBA team doesn't want to review every pull request, sometimes it really is kind of the issue of, it's pretty safe to make changes to most of the environment, but if you touch that big table over there or anything related to it, we need to be real careful. And you can, do things like set up, filters to say, oh yeah, we want to add reviewers for this if we're touching files with these names or something like that. So bringing review in on the pull request, I think really changes the whole dynamic, because you are literally looping people into the pipeline. The other place, the thing that I really found in my experience was helpful was, and there's, I don't know if you've talked about this on the podcast before, there's this site I just really love, the DevOps Topologies site. And they've got an upcoming book about DevOps topologies, but it shows different relationships between different teams. And they show one topology that includes specifically database people that they say this can work in some situations. And I've seen it really, really work. Essentially, the model is you identify some people on the dev side who are either particularly interested in databases or they have some talent for it. And they become sort of the specialists on the database for that team. And the main value that they add, they add a ton of value, but the main value that they added in my experience was you kind of, after you work with them for a while, they become really good at identifying points where it would be useful to have a short architecture conversation with the database team. Right? Because they know the tricky bits and they have relationships with the database team where they can just, hit somebody up real casually and say, hey, have we had issues around this? So they develop this greater expertise over the operation side. They're more likely to learn about kind of production issues and the resolutions of them. And that topology in particular, I found to be really effective.
And I think I found it at DevOpsTopologies.com.
Yes.
It looks like the one you're referring to for our listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. So they have topologies for free on that site. I think it's really, really interesting in terms of thinking through how are our teams actually going to work together? And they do anti-patterns as well as patterns, which I just love and am crazy about.
Nice.
So yeah, I think they have some real helpful advice for interfacing with very siloed database teams and breaking down that silo on there.
Okay. Now you mentioned pull requests, so that would imply branching.
Yes.
Yes. What's your view on branching, which would kind of create alternate universes in the source, especially if you're adding columns to tables on one branch versus another? So how does that fit in?
Yeah, branching is one of the topics I actually get a lot of questions about from people who are looking to go into database DevOps. And so it's an interesting thing because the database hasn't been brought into these methodologies, there is still a lot of people out there who are using shared development databases. And that makes branching really awkward. So essentially,
it's a global.
Right. Like even if I create a branch in source control and I'm working on it, if my changes are going to a database that's shared by other people, well, okay, the T-SQL is isolated in my branch, but it's certainly not isolated in that database. And
right.
I can do things that, of course, can wreak havoc with anyone else who's working in a different branch. This is still incredibly common. And to me, it's one of those things that we really need to get past. There's a fantastic blog post by Troy Hunt from like 2011. And it's called something like the unnecessary evil of the shared development database. And back then goes through point by point, like, especially if you're working with Microsoft products, and this is also true for open source, but like you do not have to license your developer edition database. You don't have to pay for that license, right? So storage is very, very cheap now. We have and there's things, that are even more recent since his post with the rise of containerization and virtualization and the ability to virtualize storage. Like there are so many different ways that you can have your own development environment that is not shared. And having that really unlocks the power of branching, right? Because, and this is one of the things that's been missing from database development for a long time. The very simple thing that people have been enjoying with app code for many years is you really do need an environment where it's safe to experiment, where you can say, hey, what if I did this crazy thing? And maybe it is destructive to the environment you're working on. You need the freedom to be able to do that. So to me, the most essential thing about branching is also, like one of the things that's different with databases is to unlock the power of branching, you need to also have more of a mindset where you're like, what is the best way that we can cost effectively and efficiently also set up dedicated development environments for people that work with this branching strategy and also work with a strategy using something like pull requests, right? Because when I do a pull request, I want to, for my database code, also be able to do things that people do for app code, like automatically run a build and maybe automatically provision and deploy my changes to an environment where they can be reviewed, right? Yeah. So these are all things that like they've been, they're kind of just very normal for app code, but it's really been skipped over for database code, but it's all really, really possible to do with database code. I found
troyhunt.com/unnecessary evil of shared development.
Yes, seems to be the one. It.
So in that world, in a DevOps world, you do have a continuous integration build before you package and deploy anything. And so the continuous integration build does need to run something against a database. It would either go against a database that's already there or possibly provision it and create it from whatever's in source control. Yeah. Which, if you're branching and multiple builds are running at the same time but on different branches, then you do need some environment that would be resilient to databases dedicated to just that build that's running.
Yes.
And not have the server, the database server with the database name.
Absolutely,
and create all these global dependencies.
Right. Yeah. And that very much is where the future is, I think. And I think that the pattern, some of the patterns that we're working on at Redgate. So at Redgate, we have a great team called the Foundry, and we have a lot of great teams. If people from Redgate are listening, like, sorry, it's not that the Foundry is my favorite, but
it's just a different great team.
Yeah. They have an interesting role because they do research and they're kind of an internal disruptor within the company. And I think this is actually an interesting thing in software development is having a group in your company who is kind of a disruptor. They explore things, they look for what should the future of this be like. And so a lot of what they're looking at, they have a project called Spawn. And a lot of it is stories about, okay, if I'm doing work on database development, what should happen automatically? So, for example, they have prototypes and even a thing they've built out that says, when I create a branch for this database code, automatically provision for me a database that's had masking applied to it. So it's a safe database to work at and assign it to my branch. So I have a place to work along with having a private place to work on my app code. And there's a lot of different uses for it. I mean, one of the things they point out is the more of this you automate, like when you bring new people into your team, there is just not that much they need to learn to get started. You really want people to be able to move from team to team in your organization and ramp up real fast. And automating all of these things so that you don't have to think about, you just create your branch. You don't have to think about provisioning the database yourself. It just happens. And it's got some logic in there to know, hey, you're working on this. This is what you want. Things like that, I think, really are the future, where it's just by default that things happen kind of similarly to the way they do for application code. So really excited. I mean, we have products that do similar things already, but the Foundry is really working on ways to kind of make them really, really seamless with containers and with the newest technology.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So many people are talking about database deployments and automating that. And then, of course, the corollary when they get there is think, okay, if it fails, then how do I roll back?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So it's a really fun one. So I was listening to, and this is kind of going a long way around for your question, but I watched a video yesterday from Microsoft. It was one of their program managers. It was recorded when they were still VSTS, but of course now they're the Azure DevOps team. Which
is just last year.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not that long ago, right? But it's Edward Thompson is his name. It's Thompson without a P. And this is right on the Microsoft Books Online, but he describes the branching strategy they use in VSTS, but he also describes the branching strategy that GitHub uses because he worked at GitHub for a while. And it was actually really interesting. I promise rollbacks play into this. So what he described as what they do at GitHub, the GitHub flow, he says there's one part of it that's often missed when people describe it. And the thing that they do, I think this is amazing for app code, it's not so amazing for database code. But what they actually do is when they do a pull request, they have, and there's a chat bot involved in this too that's kind of interactive. But when you do a pull request and you're getting ready to merge it in, before you actually merge in the pull request, they actually deploy it to production. Before you merge it in, before you complete the pull request, they deploy it to production. And there's some fanciness around here where you can deploy it to Canary, which is described as, just a small set of production servers so you can monitor things. But essentially, while you're doing this process, the master branch is locked. So it's kind of hard to scale this past a certain number of people because no one else can do this while you're doing it.
It's got to be fast.
Essentially, it's this automated testing in production way. And so the question is, what if, you're in this process and your pull request has been deployed before it's actually been merged in, and you see something where you're like, no. Well, in that case, they do a rollback and they just redeploy what is in master because we haven't completed our pull request, and that is their rollback. And I love this model. I think it's really fascinating, but for database code, it just doesn't work, right? Because what is the rollback for our code? We can't just redeploy what's in master necessarily. It may or may not have anything to do with the change. It doesn't have an automatic undo.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing some form of state-based deployment, the state in master may or may not undo the state change that you have done in there. And if you're doing a migration style, there's no automatic undo there.
Database deployments are kind of like painting the walls inside your house. Once you've put the paint down, you can't just, give me that paint back. Exactly. And you're not going to bulldoze your house and quickly rebuild it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a hard one. So a lot of the advice that's given, there's kind of this mantra of we always roll forward, we don't roll back. And I'm not really down with that. I am, as much as I've drank the Kool-Aid, like if there is a DevOps like beverage, like I have drank the beverage, I still have worked in, environments where if we have something wrong with the database, we need to fix it right away because we are bleeding money as much as that happens, right? Like we need to be able to do critical break fix. And that means that it is worth time in the software development lifecycle to think about if something goes wrong, what is the undo for this? Now, I don't think you have to write an undo script for every change, right? Because sometimes we should try to design changes as much as possible where, hey, if something goes wrong, we're going to turn off this feature flag in the application, right? Where the undo is literally turn that thing off. Feature flag. But I do think it's also worth having a phase where we think about, okay, if we did have to undo the database change, how complicated is it? And if it's really complicated, that's probably an indication that we need to break our change into smaller changes, if at all possible, right? We may be doing too much of a big bang if the undo is just terrible, right? Maybe we should redesign things somehow so that we can, maybe it's more complicated to deploy, but do this in a different way so that the undo isn't so terrible, right? That doesn't mean we have to always write an undo script. It does mean we have to always think about it fairly early in the cycle, though.
Well, let's say you do write undo scripts. Where does that fit in with all the tooling? Because it is kind of designed to, there's a new build. Let me deploy the new build.
Right.
I don't know any build server or any deployment server that says, it's the last build. I mean, Octopus Deploy has a deploy button. All the tools have a deploy button. None of them actually have a rollback button.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So where do those undo scripts even go?
Yeah, I mean,
is it you're in manual land? Run the undo script.
I think it's going to maybe be that in some environments. It really depends. What is the requirement for deployment time? So if you're running, say, a credit card system, right? Like if you have a system that is literally performing, transactional, people are making payments, and you have a situation where people can no longer process. In that type of organization, people may want more of a topology, more of like a site reliable, an SRE model, right? Where you've got engineers who may have their own way of, and it may involve either manual or automated, but deploying things really quickly without going back to the original dev team and going through a full build cycle. Mm-hmm. I do think it's harder to maintain and run those teams, right? Usually these are done by teams who operate at great scale. And I do think these are edge case environments, right? But with that kind of environment, the owners of the business and your customers, they may not want to wait for a new build to run for you to be able to deploy something. So you may have to come up with a way to automate a predefined script for very critical changes that has been, stored somewhere in source control already that has already been tested. And we do have ways in Redgate with our SQL change automation project. We have some ways to do that. It is not an undo button in the app, though. Technically, you are kind of it's like pre-planning a roll forward. Yeah. So that's I'm down with the roll forward thing. I just think you need to, in some environments, plan your roll forward for critical changes. Yeah.
Some questions I've got is asking, okay, how does this process solve the database problem, get it back online problem? And I think just the literal answer is DevOps and automated deployments are not going to solve the problem of, your database, something's wrong with it. But if we accept that and stop trying to force it, then we can get past the questions of, okay, my change was dropping a column. Now, roll me back, go. Mm-hmm. How does your product do it? And raise it up to the architectural level like you're talking about and saying, well, if my change includes dropping a column, maybe let's not do it that way. Mm-hmm. Let's make the column dormant for a while until we're sure that it can actually go away. And then dropping it is like, okay, it's no big deal at that point because the application stopped using it a while ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it is this issue is even broader than rollbacks too, because for these organizations where time is super critical, it's not just a change gone wrong that you may need to respond to faster than the pipeline will move easily, right? So sometimes with databases, you just hit these performance edge cases where something that was fine before is just not fine now. And you need to apply some duct tape to it, right? Like you're going to do a more thoughtful way to handle it later with your real processes. But someone literally needs to get out the duct tape and force query optimization to happen in a certain way or change an index really, really fast. And similar to the rollback case, like in that one, it's hard to plan that one ahead of time, but you just need in some environments to respond really urgently and really fast and either have a very streamlined route through your pipeline or have a way that's, kind of everyone's down with to very quickly triage, deploy a fix, and then run it back through the software development lifecycle and have a documented way that, okay, this has already been deployed to that environment, but we need to work this into source control, make sure that we handle it properly, and so that it's an actual, part of the system, and, maybe think about in some cases, less duct tapey fix for long term. So I think rollbacks is a popular topic, but there is, for critical environments, a larger area around this, which is just urgent incident response, right? Maybe it's to a software change and it's kind of a rollback, but maybe it's just we hit a tipping point on something. We hit a tipping point on, size of the table and the way that the database engine is optimizing queries, and suddenly, nothing's working right, which has happened to me many, many times.
Full text search tuning can do that to us too.
Oh my goodness. Just once I worked on this database as a consultant that was many, many hundreds of terabytes, and the full text indexes were just hundreds of gigabytes or at least a terabyte. And it was so unpredictable what would happen.
Well, you throw in a terabyte of data and I don't think there's any simple operations anymore.
Yeah.
There was long ago in my career, there was a change script that was the SQL tuning wizard kind of generated some change scripts and they work great. Well, one of them turned out actually included the change to a clustered index. Now in production, that table, massive. So the temp database just happily ate up every bit of available hard drive space and totally took down the database cluster.
Yeah.
Because when you run out of disk space, then that's what happens.
Then you get the automatic rollback, and no one. So it's real fun, especially in SQL Server. I mean, this is true for other databases as well. But so in SQL Server, for example, rollback is single threaded. So if your thing that went through forward was parallel, like your rollback is probably going to take longer. Also, you've got all this logging you've got to do. I mean, right? Like
and your system's down while you're doing it.
Yeah. That's
so, okay. So people are thinking, okay, this is great about process and how I should think about it and whatnot. But what about the tools? What tools should I be looking at? And you're from Redgate, the premier SQL Server tools on the market. So what are the options? What should people be looking at?
Yeah. So with Redgate, we're also expanding into Oracle, but SQL Server is still our primary user base. And with SQL Server, SQL Change Automation is absolutely my favorite product because it really empowers people to do really specific changes, right? So if for example, let's say I have the type of code base where I have one code base, but it's going to get deployed to many different databases because each database is single tenant, right? So I've got many copies of the database in production. I've got one copy of the source control. And maybe, this sometimes happens with these environment, I've got enterprise edition for some of my production environments, my really big customers, but I've got some standard edition for smaller customers, right? So I could do things like write a change to say, if you're running against one of the expensive servers, use online equals on for an index change. I want this to be as online as possible, but don't do that on standard edition, right? Because if you try to do it, it'll fail if you run that against standard edition. So you can control things like that in a really granular level in your migration scripts. But the thing I really like about the SQL change automation product is that it also has a state-based view of the database at different times. And that is really helpful for merging in a branch into source control, because if I only have migration scripts, if I only have incremental changes like add a column or create an index, and I don't have a view of the state of the whole table, when I merge my branch back in, how do I identify a merge conflict? Having that state-based representation. So that combination of understanding the state of the database as well as letting you control really granular migration scripts is what I think makes that SQL change automation product so powerful. We are now making it available in Management Studio, which a lot of our customers have been asking for. So it's been in Visual Studio for a while. It used to be known as Ready Roll. But now it's also available in Management Studio, which I think will also help a lot of folks from more of the DBA side embrace the product, because a lot of those folks they look at Visual Studio and they're kind of like, whoa, that's
not for me.
It's got an object explorer, but it's not the one I know.
Right. It's different.
Yeah. So that product also has extensions for things like Azure DevOps to help you do build and deploy operations in there too. So that's really the heart, I think, of our DevOps offering for databases.
Yeah, and I've used that one. It's fantastic. The seamless process. If you're inside Visual Studio and writing some code and it needs a change, you go and make the change. It suggests the change script, and you say, "Oh, that looks good," or you tweak it a little bit, hit the button. It puts it right there in your solution for you, and then you do your git commit. It's right there with the application code that was just written, and then the build pipeline takes it from there. I mean, it's the absolute seamless process. The open source tools do kind of some of the internals and the deployments, but just the developer experience provided, integrated right there in Visual Studio. I mean, not a product plug, but it's actually pretty cool.
Yeah. I love working in Visual Studio now, and this is not something I would have ever expected, I would say.
Heresy.
I like to say that, the Visual Studio is one of those things that I love until I hate it with the fire of 1,000 suns. But I mean, it's a complex tool, right? So when things aren't working right, you just get real mad at it. But like most of the time, I'm really happy with it. And I love working there because it is, especially the integration with Azure DevOps, everything I want is right there. And I can really, really work quite a lot in there. There is, I often work with, the Azure DevOps services rather than servers. So there is a point where I trade off and go, work in Azure DevOps services in a browser. But it really, the workflow I really, really like in there. I will say to folks that as much as I love SQL change automation, it is very much like riding a bicycle. It's one of those things where, and I very much remember learning to ride a bicycle. You fall off a little bit when you're getting started, right? Because it's complex enough that there's a learning curve. Once you know how to ride the bicycle, you have this great experience. But when you get started, it is helpful to start with a simpler database. It's and this is, I think, true for a lot of things. If you start with a legacy thing that's really complex, you've got to learn a lot to ride. Like it's a hard bike to ride.
Good point.
When you're first getting started, start with a simple bike to ride. That will teach you the basics, and that will give you the foundation. That will, it's kind of a training wheel situation. So don't start with your database that has complex dependencies and tons of linked servers and all sorts of craziness in it. When you're first getting started, start with something simpler where you can really learn how it works, and then just add, complexity. And once you understand the workings of the tool.
Yeah,
so
good point.
That was the mistake I made when I first started working with it. Is I was like, oh, I'll work with a database that is one of the most complicated things possible. That'll be a great way to learn.
I think the linked database and cross database queries of any kind, I think that just brings in a whole bunch of extra dependencies regardless of what tool that you're using. That's a big one. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So this is a lot of information. And if our listeners are thinking, okay, where should I go to learn more? What should I do next? Are there any go-to resources that you particularly love and would recommend?
Well, I am kind of biased towards the ones I've made.
You think? You do a lot of videos.
I'm like, I do some videos. So one of the things that I am a learner who, when I learn things, I like to touch them. So I would absolutely recommend, as a way of getting started, to download a free trial. That, to me, I learn by doing. We also have a resource online called Redgate University, which is totally free, and it has a ton of videos. This isn't something I made. So I actually am listing something. I'm in a couple of them, but it's a larger Redgate initiative to have videos that help people get started and get going. So that's really the way I would start. If I had past Kendra and with current resources, I would be like, yep, download the free trial and hit up Redgate Uni and look at, the videos on getting started with SQL change automation, and that'll, get you going. But because I am so much of a hands-on learner, I like to try to, I watch a video and then I'm like, okay, how can I kind of replicate this on my own and work with it that way? It's my favorite.
Awesome. I think it's redgate.com/hub/university.
Yeah.
For those of you pulling it up. So, well, fantastic. Well, thanks, Kendra, for all the time and sharing your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeffrey. It's been wonderful chatting on the podcast.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.